Richard Lawson sat alone at a table in one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants, surrounded by the clinking of glasses and the hum of laughter. Yet, despite the opulence enveloping him, he felt an overwhelming emptiness gnawing at his heart. Outside, the rain poured relentlessly, each droplet racing down the glass like tears, mirroring the sorrow that had become his constant companion. For over 2 decades, the world had been a canvas of gray and gloom since the tragic loss of his beloved wife, Emily. No amount of wealth or success could fill the void her absence had carved into his soul. I've noticed only 98% of you who watch haven't subscribed. Come on, guys. Show some love and support. Thanks a bunch to those who have already subscribed. He had built a financial empire, yet each victory felt hollow, a mere distraction from the pain that clung to him like a shadow. Business meetings and lavish dinners had become mere rituals, devoid of meaning. Richard swirled the wine in his glass, watching it spin in circles, a reflection of his own life, caught in a loop of grief and solitude. With a heavy sigh, he acknowledged the truth. Despite his accomplishments, he was utterly alone. The thought of children had never crossed their minds. Emily had never wanted to discuss it, and he had respected her wishes. Now he found himself haunted by regret, longing for a piece of her to nurture and love. And, as he paid the bill and slipped into his wool coat, the restaurant buzzed with life, but to Richard it was just noise, distant and disconnected, as if he were a ghost wandering through a world that no longer belonged to him. Stepping out onto the rain-soaked sidewalk, he felt the chill seep into his bones, a stark reminder of his solitude. The familiar route home passed places that echoed with memories of happier times spent with Emily. Each corner, each building, whispered stories of a life that had once been vibrant and full of promise, now reduced to mere ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like every other day, he would visit Emily's grave. It was a ritual that had become both a comfort and a burden. She had chosen to rest in New York, a city that symbolized the new life they had begun together, a life cruelly cut short. As he walked, lost in thought, something caught his eye beneath the awning of a nearby shop. A young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby in her arms, her damp hair framing a face that looked fragile and worn. The sight tugged at something deep within Richard, stirring emotions he thought had long since faded. He paused, uncertainty gripping him. He was not the kind of man to get involved in such situations. His charitable donations had always been made from a distance. Yet, something about this young woman compelled him to approach. Perhaps it was the tenderness with which she held the baby, a reminder of the love he had once shared with Emily. With a deep breath, Richard stepped forward, rain dripping from his coat, and pulled out $350 in cash. Money he had just withdrawn from an ATM. "Here," he said, his voice steady yet soft. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up at him, her eyes widening in surprise before filling with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. In that fleeting moment, Richard felt a connection to this stranger, as if their shared pain bridged the gap between their worlds. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their unspoken bond, and turned to walk away. Yet, as he continued down the street, the image of the woman and her baby lingered in his mind, awakening something deep within him that he thought had long been dormant. That night, Richard lay in bed, the sound of rain tapping against the window his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the memory of the young woman and her child replayed in his mind like a haunting melody. Tomorrow he would visit Emily's grave, but little did he know that this routine visit was about to alter the course of his life forever. The next morning, Richard followed his usual ritual, dressing in his tailored suit and preparing for the somber visit to the cemetery. The gray sky mirrored his mood, and the city remained drenched from the previous night's storm. As he made his way to the grave, his thoughts drifted back to the young woman. Why had she stayed with him in his mind? He couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been significant, a sign of something he was yet to understand. Arriving at the cemetery, Richard took the familiar path toward Emily's grave, the quiet surroundings only interrupted by the rustling leaves and distant city sounds. He stood before her headstone, ready to speak to her, as he always did, but today felt different. As he approached, he noticed someone kneeling at the grave. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same young woman from the night before, her baby cradled in her arms, her shoulders shaking, as if she were crying. Richard stopped in his tracks, confusion washing over him. How could she possibly know about Emily? The coincidence felt unsettling. He approached cautiously, his voice low and uncertain. "Excuse me," he said. The woman looked up, startled, her red-rimmed eyes meeting his. "I'm sorry," she stammered, trying to compose herself. "I didn't mean to intrude. You were here yesterday," Richard said slowly, still trying to process the situation. "I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby, and Richard felt a surge of urgency. "What are you doing here? How do you know Emily?" After a moment of hesitation, she took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pain and resolve. "Emily, she was my mother," she said softly. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him, disbelief washing over him. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Emily never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did. She just never told you." Richard took a step back, the weight of her revelation crashing down on him. No, he thought, this can't be right. He had spent over 2 decades mourning the loss of his wife, believing he knew everything about her. Now he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound it changed everything. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why didn't she tell me?" Sophie, the woman, looked down, her voice filled with sadness. "I don't know. I never knew her. She died before I could meet her. I was raised by another family." Richard's heart ached at the thought. He had lived his life believing he knew everything about Emily, only to discover that there were chapters of her life he had never read. "Why now?" he asked, his voice strained. "Why are you here?" Sophie met his gaze, and for the first time, Richard saw something familiar in her eyes, a glimmer of Emily. "I found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since. When I found out where she was buried, I had to come." Richard stared at her, still struggling to process everything. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and anger. But beneath it all, there was a spark of hope. A hope that somehow this connection to Emily hadn't been lost after all. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Emily really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild, a piece of Emily that still existed in the world. For the first time in years, Richard felt something other than grief. "Is this my grandchild?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the child. Sophie looked down at the baby, a soft smile breaking through her tension. "Yes," she said quietly. "His name is Daniel." Richard stared at the baby, who looked so small and fragile, and his heart swelled with a mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Daniel was a connection to Emily, a living reminder of the life they could have had together, a life that had been hidden from him for all these years. As Richard processed this revelation, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. For years, he had been stuck in the past, mourning Emily and the life they had lost. Now, standing here with Sophie and Daniel, he realized that life hadn't disappeared completely. It had continued silently, without him. and now he was being given a chance to reclaim a piece of it. But the betrayal still lingered. Now, how could Emily have kept this from him? How could she have made such a monumental decision without even telling him she was pregnant? Right? And I don't understand, Richard said finally, his voice hoarse. Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone? Sophie looked down at the ground, her expression filled with empathy. I don't know the details, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child, or maybe she thought you were too focused on your business to be a father. I don't know, Richard. I wish I did. Richard shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide. Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you. The idea that Emily had kept Sophie a secret out of some misguided sense of protection left Richard feeling conflicted. But her sad longing had driven him. It had nothing to do with sense of protection left Richard feeling conflicted. He had always believed that Emily trusted him, that they were partners in everything. Now, he was beginning to see that there were parts of her he had never really known. Richard's eyes met Sophie's again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to Sophie, but to the life he never knew existed, to the possibilities that had been lost but could now be reclaimed. What do you want from me? Richard asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. I don't want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from, and I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife. Richard nodded, the weight of her words settling in. The truth about Emily, the truth he had spent so many years without. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing. His life had just been irrevocably changed. There was no going back to the way things had been. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. Sometimes in the daytime, you have to think about the future. And right now, that future was no longer so bad. As Richard stood frozen, staring at Sophie, his mind struggled to grasp the magnitude of what she had just revealed. Emily had a daughter, his daughter, a life he had never known, hidden from him all these years. The betrayal stung, but it was layered with confusion, regret, and something else he hadn't expected: responsibility. Sophie and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to be part of. But they were here now, standing right in front of him. I still don't understand, Richard finally said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger fading into something softer. Emily never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me? Sophie looked down at the baby, her voice gentle but firm. I don't know what her reasons were, Richard. I've asked myself the same question over and over again, but I never got any answers. All I know is that she made that choice, whatever her reasons, and it's affected both of us. Richard took a deep breath, his mind reeling. He had spent so many nights lying awake, thinking about what they could have had together if only things had gone differently. Now it seemed like those what-ifs had taken on a whole new painful meaning. I wish I knew more. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months trying to piece together what happened, and the truth is, there are a lot of gaps, but I know one thing for sure. She loved you. Richard's eyes widened at that. She told you that? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. No, Sophie said softly, shaking her head. But I've seen it in everything I found about her. The way she talked about you to people, the way she lived her life. It was always clear that you were important to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things. Richard clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He had spent years trying to make sense of Emily's death, coming to terms with the fact that they would never have the future they had dreamed of. But this revelation had reopened old wounds he thought had healed. Now I'm not just mourning the loss of my wife, he said, his voice breaking. I'm mourning the life I never knew about, the daughter I never had the chance to raise. Sophie looked down at Daniel, her expression filled with empathy. I understand, she said softly. I've spent my whole life feeling like a secret, like I didn't belong anywhere. But now we have a chance to change that. Richard took a deep breath, his heart aching. He had lived in a world of solitude for so long, and now, standing here with Sophie and Daniel, he felt the stirrings of something new. A connection. A family he never knew he had. I don't want to lose you, Richard said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Whatever happens, whatever we find out, I don't want this to come between us. Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. You're not going to lose me, Richard. We're in this together. Richard felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't the answer he had been hoping for, but it was enough for now. It was enough to know that they were both willing to face the uncertainty of the future together. The days that followed were filled with a cautious optimism. Richard and Sophie began to see more of each other, navigating their complicated relationship with honesty and patience. There were still moments of tension, still questions that lingered between them, but they were learning to face those challenges together. Richard found himself looking forward to the time he spent with Sophie and Daniel, cherishing the simple moments of laughter and joy that filled their days. One afternoon, Sophie invited Richard to her apartment for the first time. As he stepped inside, he was struck by the warmth of the space. A modest but cozy home filled with toys and the faint scent of baby lotion. It was a world he had missed out on for so long, and as he watched Sophie interact with Daniel, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to be part of their lives. I'm really glad you're here, Sophie said, her voice soft but sincere. This was the first time she had tried to admire one of their children, and it was very sad. I know it hasn't been easy, but I think we're figuring this out together. Richard nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. I've made mistakes, and there's a lot I wish I could change, he admitted. But I'm grateful for this. Grateful for you and Daniel. They sat together, watching Daniel giggle at the ducks swimming by, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. The past still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden he couldn't carry. Instead, it was a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had to look forward to. As the weeks turned into months, Richard's life continued to shift in ways he never thought possible. He and Sophie grew closer, navigating their relationship with honesty and patience. Richard became more involved in Daniel's life, finding joy in the simple moments of being a grandfather. Whether it was taking Daniel to the park, reading him stories, or simply watching him explore the world, Richard felt a new kind of happiness blossoming within him. One evening, as Richard sat in his apartment looking out over the city skyline, he realized how much had changed. The loneliness that had once defined him was no longer there. In its place was a sense of connection and belonging that he hadn't felt in years. He still visited Emily's grave from time to time, but those visits were different now. They were less about mourning and more about reflecting on the love they had shared, and the life he was now building with Sophie and Daniel. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Richard felt a quiet contentment settle over him. It wasn't the life he had imagined all those years ago, but it was a life he had come to cherish. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future, no matter how uncertain, could be filled with hope.